They say a man reveals his true nature when the world strips away his mask. Tonight, I'm going to show you what happens when England's most untouchable aristocrat discovers that power, legacy, and honor are nothing but elegant lies told by those who've never faced real ruin. Stay with me until the blood dries and the ashes settle, because what you think you know about the Duke of Blackthorn is exactly what they wanted you to believe. 8. The rain came down like divine judgment on London that November night, hammering the cobblestones of Covent Garden until the streets resembled rivers of black ink. Adrian Blackthorn stood in the shadow of the abandoned Royal Opera House, watching water cascade from the broken gutters 3 stories above. His evening coat was already soaked through, expensive wool clinging to his shoulders like a second skin, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. Because waiting inside those darkened halls was either his salvation or his complete destruction, and he'd stopped being able to tell the difference weeks ago. He'd received the note at midnight. 3 words written in elegant script on cream paper that cost more than most Londoners earned in a month. Come alone. Tonight. No signature, no explanation. Just an address he recognized from childhood, the opera house where his mother used to drag him before consumption took her. Before his father retreated into ledgers and land disputes, before Adrian learned that being a duke meant performing nobility while practicing cruelty behind closed doors. Thunder cracked overhead. Adrian pushed through the iron gate, its hinges screaming in protest. The main entrance gaped open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, darkness swallowed everything except the faint glow of candlelight bleeding through the cracks in a second-floor doorway. His boots echoed against marble floors littered with debris. Velvet curtains hung in tatters. The chandelier that once held 500 candles lay shattered across the orchestra pit like a crystal skeleton. Somewhere in the walls, water dripped with metronomic precision, counting down to something inevitable. Adrian climbed the grand staircase, each step amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. The candlelight grew brighter, warmer. He could smell beeswax and something else. Perfume. Expensive. Foreign. The kind of scent that didn't belong in this graveyard of culture and dead dreams. He reached the doorway. Inside, the private box where nobility used to sit and pretend they appreciated art had been transformed into something else entirely. Dozens of candles burned on every available surface. Rain hammered against the tall windows, distorting the view of London below into something abstract and violent. And there, standing with her back to him, silhouetted against the storm, was a woman who shouldn't exist. She turned slowly, deliberately, like she was performing for an audience only she could see. Black hair fell in waves past her shoulders. Her dress was burgundy silk, cut in a way that suggested Paris rather than London, confidence rather than modesty. But it was her eyes that stopped Adrian cold, gray as winter fog, sharp as fresh grief, and completely, utterly unafraid. "Tell me your name," Adrian said. His voice came out rougher than intended. The woman smiled. It wasn't warm. "You already know my name, Your Grace. You've known it since the 3rd time you inquired about me through your sources. Since you paid that investigator £200 to follow me through Whitechapel. Since you read the report detailing everywhere I've been, everyone I've spoken to, every secret I've tried to hide." Adrian felt something cold slide down his spine. Celeste Vale. She inclined her head mockingly. The notorious widow of a merchant who died under suspicious circumstances. The woman who somehow gained access to drawing rooms that should have remained forever closed to someone of her station. The puzzle you couldn't solve. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Outside, lightning turned the windows white for a heartbeat. "You sent the note." "I sent many notes," Celeste said, moving along the edge of the opera box, trailing one finger across the dusty railing. "Most of them you ignored. But this one? This one I knew would bring you running, because by now you've realized something's happening, haven't you? Your colleagues are nervous. Your father's old friends are making mistakes. The invincible empire of English nobility is starting to crack, and you can feel it even if you can't see it yet." Adrian's hand instinctively moved toward the pocket where he kept a small pistol. Not to threaten, simply habit. Survival instinct honed by years of watching his father's enemies disappear into scandal, or worse. Celeste noticed, laughed softly. "You won't need that. Not tonight. Tonight I'm offering you something far more dangerous than violence." She crossed to a small table Adrian hadn't noticed before. On its surface lay a leather portfolio, its edges worn but its contents clearly precious. She rested her hand on it like a priest touching a sacred text. Inside this case, Celeste continued, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, is documentation proving that the 17 most powerful families in England have been orchestrating wars, manipulating markets, and eliminating rivals for the past 30 years. Your father's signature appears 83 times. Your uncle's name is on documents authorizing the theft of colonial fortunes. Your mentor, Lord Whitmore, personally ordered the execution of 12 witnesses who threatened to expose the entire operation. The room tilted. Adrian gripped the back of a chair. That's impossible. Is it? Celeste moved closer. Her perfume was overwhelming now, jasmine and something darker, like smoke from a fire that hadn't been lit yet. Is it impossible that men with unlimited power would use it? Is it impossible that your father, who taught you that nobility meant being willing to make hard choices, actually meant it? Or is it just impossible for you to admit that everything you've built your identity on is a monument to corruption? Adrian's jaw clenched. Why are you telling me this? Why not go directly to the authorities? Because the authorities are part of it, she said simply. The judges, the ministers, the commissioners, they're all either complicit or compromised. There's no one to tell. No one except the one man who might actually give a damn. She was standing close enough now that Adrian could see the candlelight reflecting in her eyes like distant stars. Close enough that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow. Close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin despite the cold rain hammering the windows. Why would I give a damn? Adrian asked quietly. Celeste reached up, placing one hand flat against his chest. Because 3 years ago, the conspiracy your father helped build destroyed my family. They stole our shipping company, forged documents proving my father was a traitor, and watched him hang himself in debtor's prison while they divided his assets among themselves. My mother died in a workhouse 6 months later. My younger brother, her voice cracked, just once. Just enough for Adrian to understand that beneath the calculated performance was a woman who'd been shattered and had spent years gluing herself back together with rage and patience. Your brother? Adrian prompted. Disappeared, Celeste finished. 14 years old, gone. And every investigation dead-ended at the same place. Nobility closes ranks. Power protects itself. Justice is just another word for what rich men decide it means. She stepped back, composing herself. That's why you'll care. Because somewhere underneath the title and the estates and the carefully maintained reputation, you're still the boy who watched his mother die while his father counted coins. You're still the man who knows that everything you have came at someone else's expense. You're still human enough to hate yourself for it. Thunder exploded overhead. The candles flickered but held. Adrian stared at the portfolio on the table. His father's signature. 83 times. 30 years of coordinated cruelty transformed into family fortune and social position. If I open that case, Adrian said slowly, everything changes. Everything already changed, Celeste replied. The moment I sent that note, the moment you walked through that door, the moment you didn't immediately turn and run. You just haven't accepted it yet. Adrian crossed to this table, opened the portfolio. Inside were documents rendered in precise legal language, contracts, memoranda, financial records. Names he recognized, dates he remembered, evidence that transformed vague suspicions into concrete damnation. He read for 5 minutes. 10. The rain continued its assault. Celeste watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, Adrian looked up. These prove everything. The colonial manipulations, the war profiteering, the manufactured scandals used to destroy competing families. This is the end of the world, you know, Celeste finished. The question is whether you have the courage to burn it down. Adrian's hands trembled. Not from fear, from something else. Something that felt like rage finally given permission to exist. His entire life had been a performance of inherited nobility, playing the role his father had scripted, maintaining the illusion that aristocratic power came from merit rather than ruthlessness. And now this woman, this angry, brilliant, dangerous woman, was offering him the match to light it all on fire. "What's your play?" Adrian asked. Celeste moved beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We expose them, all of them. We take this evidence and we deliver it to the one institution they haven't completely corrupted, the newspaper syndicates. The independent publishers who've been trying to prove nobility's corruption for decades. We give them everything, with your name attached, your testimony corroborating it. They'll destroy me, Adrian said. They'll try, Celeste corrected, but you'll be too valuable as a witness, too visible to simply eliminate. And more importantly, she turned to face him fully, eyes blazing with something between conviction and madness. You'll finally be free, free from the legacy, free from the lies, free from pretending that your father's empire was anything other than blood money dressed in ermine. Adrian should have walked away, should have reported Celeste to the authorities his family controlled, should have protected the only life he'd ever known. Instead, he reached out and cupped her face in one hand, feeling the impossible softness of her skin against his calloused palm. When this is over, he said quietly, they'll call me a traitor. Celeste leaned into his touch. Good. Let them. Treason against tyrants is loyalty to humanity. He kissed her then, hard and desperate and completely improper. She responded with equal hunger, her hands fisting in his wet coat, pulling him closer. The kiss tasted like revenge and recklessness, and the particular freedom that comes from knowing you're about to destroy everything you've ever been. They broke apart, breathing hard. The candles guttered. Outside, London continued drowning. We leave tonight, Celeste said. We take the documents and we run before they realize what's happening. Adrian nodded. His country estate. We'll be safe there while we plan the next move. Celeste gathered the portfolio, securing it inside a waterproof case she'd prepared. Adrian watched her work with professional efficiency. This wasn't improvisation. This was a campaign she'd been planning for years. He was simply the final piece, the insider testimony that would make her evidence irrefutable. They descended the grand staircase together. The opera house seemed darker now, more oppressive, like the building itself knew it was hosting the final act of something significant. Adrian pushed open the main entrance and stopped. 3 figures stood in the rain-soaked courtyard, dark coats, official bearing. One of them held a lantern that cast their faces in sharp relief. Lord Whitmore stepped forward, Adrian's mentor, his father's closest friend, the man who'd taught him how to navigate aristocratic politics, how to speak in parliament, how to smile while destroying enemies. He looked older than Adrian remembered, his face carved into hard lines by decades of calculated cruelty. Adrian, Whitmore said, his voice carrying easily over the rain. Step away from the woman. Adrian's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol. Celeste pressed closer, the portfolio clutched against her chest. You've made a terrible mistake, Whitmore continued. That woman is a criminal, a blackmailer who's been targeting noble families for months. We've been tracking her movements, waiting for her to reveal her final target. And now, tragically, she's manipulated you into this compromising position. That's a lie, Celeste hissed. Is it? Whitmore's smile was poisonous. Then explain why half the documents in that case are forgeries. Explain why your real name is Catherine Byrne, daughter of a convicted forger and confidence artist. Explain why you've been photographed meeting with radical journalists and revolutionary sympathizers. Adrian felt the ground shifting beneath him. He looked at Celeste, Catherine, and saw something flicker in her expression. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. Tell me he's lying, Adrian said quietly. Celeste met his eyes. Some of it's true. My father was a forger, but only because they forced him into it. They destroyed his legitimate business first, then offered him work forging documents to incriminate their enemies. When he tried to stop, they killed him and made it look like suicide. The rain hammered down. Adrian's hand remained on his pistol grip. Adrian? Whitmore said, his voice taking on a paternal tone that made Adrian's skin crawl. Come home. We'll handle this quietly. No scandal, no consequences. You were seduced, manipulated by a professional criminal. It happens to the best of men. And if I refuse? Whitmore's expression hardened. Then you'll be arrested alongside her. Conspiracy. Treason. Attempted blackmail of the Crown's appointed representatives. Your family name will be stripped. Your estate seized. Your life as you know it will end tonight. Adrian looked at the portfolio in Celeste's arms, looked at the 3 men blocking their escape, looked at the abandoned opera house behind them, its empty windows like dead eyes watching the drama unfold. He thought about his father's signature appearing 83 times in documents authorizing atrocities. He thought about Celeste's mother dying in a workhouse, He thought about the 14-year-old boy who'd disappeared into the machinery of aristocratic power and was probably buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. He thought about what kind of man he wanted to be when the morning came. Adrian drew his pistol, but didn't aim it. Not yet. Just held it loosely at his side, rain streaming off the barrel. "Lord Whitmore," he said clearly, "you're right that I've made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't tonight." Whitmore's expression flickered. "Excuse me?" "The mistake was believing men like you when you told me that nobility meant something other than organized cruelty. The mistake was thinking my father's legacy was worth protecting. The mistake was spending 30 years pretending I didn't know exactly where our fortune came from." "Adrian," Whitmore said, voice sharp now, "think very carefully about what you're doing." "I am," Adrian replied. "For the first time in my life, I'm thinking with complete clarity." He raised the pistol. Not at Whitmore. At the opera house behind them. At the oil lamp still burning inside, visible through the broken windows. At the decades of accumulated debris and dry wood and theatrical props soaked in flammable chemicals. "If you try to stop us," Adrian said quietly, "I'll burn this building to the ground with us inside it. The scandal alone will raise questions. Investigators will come. And even if the documents burn, enough fragments will survive to destroy everything you've built." Whitmore stared at him. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Adrian's smile felt like his face was cracking. "Ask yourself if you really know me well enough to be certain." For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain fell. The city held its breath. Then Whitmore raised one hand slowly, signaling his men to stand down. "You've just sentenced yourself to death," Whitmore said coldly. "You understand that, don't you? There's nowhere in the Empire you can hide. No refuge we can't reach. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper will call you a traitor. Every magistrate will carry a warrant. Every constable will have orders to shoot on sight." "Then I'd better make the next 24 hours count," Adrian replied. He grabbed Celeste's hand, ran. They sprinted through rain-slicked alleys, dodging between buildings, cutting through markets where vendors were just beginning to set up for dawn trade. Behind them, Adrian heard shouting, whistles, the heavy footfalls of pursuit. Celeste's breath came in sharp gasps beside him. The portfolio banged against her hip with every stride. Adrian pulled her down a narrow passage between two warehouses, pressing them both against the wall as their pursuers thundered past. "Your carriage," Celeste whispered urgently. "Where is it?" 3 blocks east," Adrian replied, "but they'll be watching it. Then we need another exit." Celeste led him through a maze of back streets Adrian had never known existed. The London beneath London, where servants and criminals and people who didn't matter moved invisibly through the arteries of the great city. They emerged near the docks, where cargo ships prepared for morning departures, and the air smelled of salt water and industrial ambition. A small courier boat bobbed at a private mooring. Celeste produced a key, unlocked the security chain. "This was your backup plan?" Adrian asked. "One of them," she replied, already climbing aboard. "I've been preparing for 3 years. You don't survive this long against people like Whitmore by only having one exit strategy." They cast off, as voices echoed from the street behind them. The small engine coughed to life. Adrian took the wheel while Celeste secured the portfolio below deck. The Thames stretched before them, gray and vast in temporary salvation. The boat cut through the current. Behind them, London began to glow with early morning light. Ahead, the river widened toward the sea, toward escape, toward whatever came next. Celeste emerged from below, standing beside Adrian at the wheel. Her hair was plastered to her skull. Her expensive dress was ruined. She looked like someone who'd survived a shipwreck and decided to keep swimming anyway. "What now?" Adrian asked. "Now we disappear," Celeste said. "We take these documents and we find people who still believe truth matters more than power. We build a case so overwhelming that even the conspiracy can't bury it. And we pray that somewhere in England there are still enough decent people left to give a damn." Adrian thought about his estates, his title, his carefully maintained reputation, everything he'd spent 30 years building, all of it gone by tonight, burned to ash by his own choice. He should have felt devastated. Instead, he felt light, free, terrifyingly, exhilaratingly alive. The sun broke over the horizon. Golden light spilled across the water. And for just a moment, standing beside this dangerous woman with evidence of corruption pressed against her chest, Adrian Blackthorne allowed himself to believe that maybe destroying everything you knew was the only honest way to begin building something worth keeping. Then Celeste gasped, pointed behind them. Adrian turned back toward London, toward the opera house where they'd begun this impossible night. Flames. Massive, roaring flames consuming the abandoned building, turning 300 years of cultural history into a pillar of black smoke visible for miles. Fire that shouldn't exist. Fire that no candles could have started. Fire that had been set deliberately by people who understood that evidence doesn't just live in documents, it lives in witnesses, in locations, in the physical spaces where conspiracies are born. "Someone set that fire," Celeste whispered. "Someone who wanted to destroy any trace of our meeting." "Or someone who wanted to frame us for arson," Adrian replied, his blood turning cold. "Someone who's already spinning the narrative." The boat's radio crackled to life. An emergency broadcast. Adrian turned up the volume, seeking information regarding a fire at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. Authorities report one body recovered from the scene, identified as Minister of Trade Robert Sheffield, suspected arson. Primary suspect is Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Thornbury, believed to be traveling with female accomplice, both considered armed and extremely dangerous. Crown has authorized use of lethal force. Adrian shut off the radio. His hands were shaking. A minister dead. A national landmark destroyed. And his name attached to both, broadcast across the entire country before the smoke even cleared. "They didn't just prepare a trap," Adrian said quietly. "They prepared a narrative. This was never about stopping us. It was about making us into monsters the public would cheer to see destroyed." Celeste pressed her hands against the railing. Her knuckles were white. "They killed Sheffield, burned the opera house, and now every constable in England thinks we're murderers fleeing justice." "We are fleeing," Adrian pointed out grimly. "That part's accurate." He looked at the horizon, looked at the portfolio of evidence that was supposed to save them, looked at the woman beside him who'd promised revolution and delivered apocalypse. The sun continued rising. The boat continued moving. And behind them, London burned with accusations they couldn't disprove and a murder they didn't commit but would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. Adrian had destroyed his world to expose the truth. Now he'd have to survive long enough to make anyone believe it. The boat's engine died 3 miles downriver. Not a sputter or a cough, just sudden, complete silence, broken only by water slapping against the hull and Celeste's sharp intake of breath. Adrian tried the ignition. Nothing. Tried again. The starter clicked uselessly, a sound like a clock ticking down to their capture. "Sabotage," Celeste said flatly. She was already moving toward the engine compartment, her ruined dress dragging across the wet deck. They knew about this boat. Adrian grabbed the oars from their housing. Of course they knew. Whitmore had probably known about every contingency plan Celeste had constructed over 3 years. The old bastard didn't just react to threats. He anticipated them, dismantled them, then watched his enemies exhaust themselves against obstacles he'd placed months in advance. The current was pulling them backward, back toward London, back toward the smoke column still visible against the dawn sky. Adrian planted the oars and pulled hard, muscles screaming in protest. The boat moved sluggishly, fighting him. "We need to reach the North Bank," Celeste said, emerging from below with grease on her hands and murder in her eyes. "There's a textile mill 2 miles upriver. Old family connection. They'll hide us." "Family connection," Adrian repeated, pulling on the oars. "The same family you've been lying to me about since the moment we met?" Celeste's jaw tightened. "You want to have this conversation now, while half of England is mobilizing to put bullets in our skulls?" "Yes," Adrian said through gritted teeth. "Now seems perfect." She moved to the other oar, taking position across from him. They fell into rhythm, pulling in unison. The boat began cutting through the current more effectively. Sweat mixed with rain on Adrian's face. His shoulders burned. Celeste's breathing was controlled, measured, like she'd trained for exactly this scenario. "My name is Catherine Byrne," she said finally. "My father was Thomas Byrne, a shipping merchant who made the mistake of refusing to falsify manifests for your father's syndicate. They destroyed him systematically, forged documents, bribed judges. And when he tried to fight back, they offered him a choice: work for them as a forger, or watch his family starve." Adrian pulled harder on his oar. "Keep talking." He worked for them for 2 years, created false evidence that sent innocent men to prison, manufactured debt records that transferred properties to the syndicate. He kept records of everything he forged, dates, signatures, crimes. He thought documentation would protect him. She laughed bitterly. It got him killed instead. They reached the center of the river. The north bank was visible now, industrial structures rising through the morning mist. Adrian's arms were numb. His back screamed, but he kept pulling. The night before he died, Celeste continued, he gave me a metal box, said it contained enough evidence to hang 20 men, made me swear I'd use it, made me promise I wouldn't let them win. And the seduction? Adrian asked. The opera house meeting? Was any of it real? Celeste met his eyes across the boat. Her face was streaked with sweat and engine grease. Define real. Did I manipulate you? Yes. Did I research everything about you for months before we met? Absolutely. Did I know you were the only member of the aristocracy with enough residual conscience to potentially care? That was the entire plan. She pulled hard on her oar. The boat surged forward. But did I expect you to actually choose the truth over your inheritance? She shook her head. No. Most people in your position would have turned me in, taken credit for stopping a blackmail plot, and slept peacefully knowing they'd protected their own. You surprised me. We're even then, Adrian said. You surprised me too. Turns out professional liars are more honest than the people I called friends my entire life. They rode in silence after that. The north bank grew closer. Behind them, London continued waking. Church bells, factory whistles, the rhythmic pulse of an empire that wouldn't notice it was dying until the rot reached its heart. The textile mill loomed ahead, its brick facade stained black from decades of coal smoke. Celeste directed them to a private dock hidden behind stacks of shipping crates. They tied off the boat and climbed onto solid ground. Adrian's legs nearly buckled. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was until he stopped moving. This way, Celeste said, leading him through a maze of loading bays and storage warehouses. The mill was already operational, machines thundering in the distance, workers shouting over the industrial cacophony. Nobody looked at them twice. In the world of manual labor, 2 soaking wet aristocrats covered in grime were just more casualties of the city's indifferent cruelty. They reached a small office building attached to the main structure. Celeste knocked, 3 short, 2 long, and waited. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled back severely, eyes that assessed and dismissed threats with professional efficiency. Catherine, the woman said. Her voice carried traces of Irish somewhere in the vowels. Thought you'd be dead by now. Not yet, Margaret, Celeste replied. This is... I know who he is, Margaret interrupted, looking Adrian up and down. Every paper in London's printing his face alongside the word traitor, right about now. You've brought hell to my doorstep, girl. Celeste pulled the waterproof case containing the documents from inside her dress. I've brought justice. There's a difference. Margaret stared at the case like it was a poisonous snake. Then she stepped aside. Inside. Before someone recognizes England's most wanted duke standing in my loading yard. The office was sparse. Desk, filing cabinets, a small stove with tea brewing. Margaret locked the door behind them and closed the curtains. The sudden darkness felt like being buried alive. She lit a single oil lamp. Sit, Margaret ordered, both of you, and tell me why I shouldn't have you arrested immediately. Adrian collapsed into a chair. His entire body ached. Celeste remained standing, placing the document case on Margaret's desk like she was presenting evidence in court. The syndicate killed Minister Sheffield last night, Celeste said. Burned the Royal Opera House. They're framing us for both. By noon, there will be wanted posters with our faces in every post office and police station across England. Margaret poured 3 cups of tea with steady hands. And you came here because you're the only person I know who hates them more than she fears them, Celeste replied. Your husband died in one of their factories. Machinery they knew was faulty. Safety protocols they ignored because profit mattered more than workers' lives. Margaret's expression didn't change. She handed Adrian a cup. He didn't drink it, just wrapped his hands around the warmth. My husband's death was ruled an accident, Margaret said quietly. Received £50 compensation and a letter expressing Lord Blackthorn's sincere regrets. She looked directly at Adrian when she said his father's title. He met her gaze and saw decades of controlled rage looking back. My father was a bastard, Adrian said. I know that now. Knew it then, probably, but was too comfortable to admit it. If I could undo what he did to your family, to anyone's family, I would. But I can't. All I can do is try to stop it from continuing. Pretty words from a pretty duke, Margaret said. But words don't resurrect the dead or feed the widows your family created. No, Adrian agreed. They don't. But these documents might at least ensure their deaths meant something. He stood, crossed to the desk, opened the case, spread the documents across the surface like cards in a game of apocalypse poker. Margaret looked down, started reading. Her expression shifted gradually from skepticism to horror to something harder and colder. She read for 10 minutes without speaking. The factory sounds penetrated the walls. Machinery grinding, steam hissing, the organized chaos of industrial production. Adrian drank his tea. It tasted like ash. Finally, Margaret looked up. This proves everything. The murders, the theft, the manufactured accidents that killed men like my husband. Yes, Celeste said, and if this information becomes public, Margaret continued, it will tear apart the entire structure of English nobility. Families will fall, fortunes will be seized. The aristocracy as we know it will cease to exist. Yes, Celeste repeated. Margaret carefully stacked the documents back into the case, closed it, looked at both of them with an expression Adrian couldn't read. Good, she said simply. Burn it all down. I'll help. Adrian felt something loosen in his chest. Margaret moved to a locked cabinet, retrieved a different set of papers. You'll need new identities, travel papers, money that can't be traced. I have contacts, people who've been waiting for an opportunity like this, people who believe the working class deserves more than generational servitude to families who view them as disposable machinery. She spread her papers across the desk. Roots, safe houses, names of sympathetic newspaper editors and radical publishers who'd been trying to expose aristocratic corruption for decades. But understand something, Margaret said, her voice dropping. Once you start this, there's no stopping. They'll hunt you until you're dead, or they are. You'll never be safe, never be comfortable. Every person you meet could be an informer. Every street could be a trap. You're not just fugitives. You're soldiers in a war most people don't even know is happening. Adrian thought about his estate, his title, the life he'd spent 30 years perfecting. All of it gone now, burned away in the span of one night. He should have mourned it, should have felt some sense of loss for the person he used to be. Instead, he felt relieved, free, finally honest. Where do we start? Adrian asked. Margaret smiled. It wasn't warm. Manchester. There's an independent press that's been waiting for proof like this. We'll get you there by rail, hidden in a textile shipment. Once you're safe, we'll begin distributing copies of the documents to every newspaper that hasn't been bought off. How long? Celeste asked. To get you to Manchester? 2 days. To expose the syndicate completely? Margaret shrugged. Weeks, months. Depends on how fast the truth spreads and how effectively they try to suppress it. But once it's out, once enough people see the evidence, not even the crown will be able to protect them. There was a sharp knock at the door. 3 short, 2 long, the same pattern Celeste had used. Margaret tensed. That's James, my foreman. He shouldn't be here during shift. She crossed to the door, opened it slightly. A man's voice, low and urgent, filtered through. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. She closed the door and turned back to them. Constables, she said flatly. 6 of them. Checking the docks. They're asking about a stolen boat and 2 fugitives. Adrian's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol he still carried. How long? 10 minutes, Margaret said. Maybe less. James is trying to slow them down, but they're insistent. Celeste grabbed the document case. The tunnels. You said there were maintenance tunnels beneath the mill. Margaret was already moving, pulling aside a filing cabinet to reveal a trapdoor. Built during the factory expansion. Leads to the old sewer system, exits near the rail yards. She lifted the trapdoor. Darkness yawned beneath, smelling of damp stone and industrial waste. Adrian grabbed one of the oil lamps. Margaret, Celeste said. Thank you. Don't thank me, Margaret replied. Just make sure their deaths mean something. Make sure every family they destroyed gets to watch them fall. Adrian descended first, lamp held high. Stone steps slick with moisture. Behind him, Celeste followed with the document case. Above, Margaret closed the trap door, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by the lamp's weak glow. They moved through tunnels that predated the mill, rough-hewn passages that echoed with dripping water and the distant rumble of machinery above. Adrian tried to maintain his sense of direction, but quickly lost it in the maze of intersecting corridors. "Left here," Celeste said, her voice echoing strangely. "Margaret showed me the route last year when we first discussed contingencies." "You've been planning this for a long time," Adrian observed. 3 years, Celeste confirmed. "Since the day my mother died in that workhouse. Since I realized that justice wasn't something given, it was something taken by people desperate enough to pay the price." They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. The tunnels gradually transitioned from rough stone to brick, suggesting they'd entered the city's actual sewer system. The smell intensified, waste and chemicals, and the accumulated decay of a metropolis that never stopped producing refuse. Adrian's lamp flickered. The oil was running low. He adjusted the wick, buying them maybe another 10 minutes of light. After that, they'd be navigating by touch alone through the literal underbelly of London. "Tell me about your brother," Adrian said. "The one who disappeared?" Celeste was quiet for several steps. "His name was Thomas. After our father. He was 14 when they took him. Bright kid. Wanted to be an engineer, build bridges instead of burning them." "What happened?" She stopped walking. Adrian nearly collided with her. The lamp cast her shadow against the brick wall, making her look enormous and distorted. "He witnessed something he shouldn't have," Celeste said. "One of your father's associates meeting with a foreign agent, selling military information. Thomas was working as a messenger boy to help support the family. He delivered a package to the wrong address at exactly the wrong time." Her voice was completely flat now, emotionless. The kind of control that comes from repeating a story so many times it stops feeling real. "They grabbed him that night. We searched for weeks, months. The police did nothing, said he probably ran away. That boys from families like ours often disappear into the streets. 2 years later, someone mailed my mother a piece of cloth. Thomas's shirt, cut into strips. Nothing else. No demands. No explanation. Just proof he'd existed and didn't anymore." Adrian felt sick. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Celeste said, starting to walk again. "Be useful. Help me make sure no one else's brother disappears into the machine your family built." They reached a junction. 3 tunnels branching in different directions. Celeste studied the walls, looking for markers only she could interpret. Finally, she pointed right. "This leads to the rail yards. We need to—" Voices echoed behind them, distant but distinct. Someone was in the tunnels. Multiple someones, judging by the overlapping sounds of boots on stone. "They're following us," Adrian said. "Of course they are," Celeste replied. "Run!" They ran through darkness thick as tar, the lamp swinging wildly, casting insane shadows across the walls. The voices behind them grew louder, orders being shouted, the scrape of multiple people navigating the tight passages. Adrian's lungs burned. His legs trembled from exhaustion. Beside him, Celeste clutched the document case like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The lamp guttered. Died. Complete darkness swallowed them. "Keep moving," Celeste gasped. "Feel the wall. Left hand. Follow it." Adrian pressed his palm against slimy brick and ran blind. His shoulder struck jutting stone. His foot caught something, debris or bone or abandoned equipment, and he nearly fell. Celeste's breathing was harsh beside him. Behind them, their pursuers' lamplights began piercing the darkness, bobbing points of illumination that meant capture was measured in minutes now. "There," Celeste said. "Ahead. Light." Adrian saw it. Gray dawn filtering through a grate 20 yards ahead. They sprinted toward it with the last reserves of their strength. The grate was rusted but not locked. Adrian shoved it open and they tumbled out into a narrow alley behind the rail yards. Early morning traffic rumbled past the alley's entrance. Workers streaming toward factories. Merchants setting up stalls. The ordinary machinery of London waking up, completely unaware that 2 of England's most wanted criminals were crawling out of the sewers 50 feet away. "We need to blend in," Adrian said, assessing their appearance. They looked exactly like what they were, aristocrats who'd spent the night fleeing through industrial underbellies. Filthy. Exhausted. Completely out of place. Celeste was already moving toward the alley's exit. "There's a workhouse 2 blocks north. They distribute clothes to the destitute. We can... She stopped. Adrian looked past her and felt his heart drop into his stomach. Constables. A dozen of them, forming a cordon across the street. And standing in the center, directing their movements with the casual authority of someone who'd orchestrated manhunts before, was Lord Whitmore. He saw them immediately, smiled. It was the expression of a chess master watching his opponent realize they'd been in checkmate for the last 6 moves. "Adrian!" Whitmore called out. His voice carried easily over the street noise. Everyone nearby stopped to look. "Come quietly. This doesn't have to end badly." Adrian pulled his pistol. It was a futile gesture. One weapon against a dozen armed men, but he was past caring about odds. Celeste pressed against him, the document case trapped between their bodies. "You killed Sheffield," Adrian shouted back. "You burned the opera house. We have evidence of everything. 30 years of corruption, murder, theft. We're going to expose all of it." Whitmore's smile widened. "Are you? With what? The documents you're carrying?" He gestured to one of his men, who held up a nearly identical waterproof case. "You mean these documents? The ones we switched out while you were busy playing revolutionary in Margaret's office?" Celeste tore open the case she'd been protecting. Inside were newspapers. Ordinary newspapers. Not documents, not evidence. Just paper worth exactly nothing. "Margaret," Celeste whispered. "She betrayed us." "Not betrayed," Whitmore corrected. "Convinced. We offered her £10,000 and proof that her husband's death was legitimately an accident, not a syndicate execution. She made the rational choice." Adrian felt reality fracturing around him. The documents were gone. Their proof. Their entire purpose. Everything they'd sacrificed had been for evidence that was now in enemy hands. But Whitmore wasn't finished. He produced a sheet of paper from his coat, held it up for nearby witnesses to see. "This is a confession," he announced, signed by Minister Sheffield before his tragic death. In it, he details how Duke Adrian Blackthorne approached him months ago with a blackmail scheme, how the Duke threatened to fabricate evidence against noble families unless paid enormous sums, how Sheffield refused and was subsequently murdered for his integrity. The crowd murmured. Adrian saw their expressions shifting from curiosity to hostility. They believed it. Of course they believed it. Why wouldn't they? A respected lord telling them about an aristocratic scandal was far more palatable than the truth, that the entire system was rotten from foundation to roof. "Your own confession will follow," Whitmore continued, "after you're arrested, interrogated, and convinced that cooperation is preferable to a traitor's execution. You'll admit to the blackmail plot, the murder, the arson. You'll name Catherine Byrne as your accomplice. And then, mercifully, you'll be allowed to die quietly in prison rather than suffer public hanging." He took a step forward. The constables closed in with him. "Or," Whitmore said, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle, "you can put down the weapon, accept that you've lost. Accept that some structures are too large to topple, some systems too entrenched to change. Your father understood this. It's why he thrived. You could too, if you'd stop fighting battles you can't possibly win." Adrian looked at Celeste. She was staring at the fake documents in her hands, her expression devastated. 3 years of planning, 3 years of sacrifice, all of it dismantled in one night by people who'd been playing this game since before she was born. Something inside Adrian crystallized. Not acceptance. The opposite. Pure, clarifying rage. "You're right," Adrian said quietly. He lowered the pistol slightly. "Some structures are too large, some systems too entrenched." Whitmore nodded approvingly. "Finally, you're thinking clearly." Adrian raised the pistol again. Not at Whitmore. At the nearest gas lamp, its fuel reservoir exposed during maintenance work. "But everything burns eventually," Adrian finished. "Even empires." He fired. The gas lamp exploded in a ball of flame that sent the crowd scattering. In the chaos, Adrian grabbed Celeste's hand and ran. Not away from the rail yards, toward them. Toward the massive freight trains being loaded for morning departures. Toward the only escape that hadn't been cut off yet. Behind them, Whitmore was shouting orders. Constables fired into the chaos. Bullets ricocheted off brick walls and metal equipment. Adrian pulled Celeste behind a stack of shipping crates, breathing hard. "We've lost," Celeste said. Her voice was hollow. "They have the documents. They have the confession. We have nothing." Adrian looked at the trains, looked at Celeste's devastated expression, looked at his hands, still shaking from firing that shot. "No," he said. "We have one thing they don't." "What?" "The truth. And more importantly, we have witnesses who know the truth. Margaret might have taken their money, but other people helped you. Other people have been gathering evidence. We just need to find them." The sound of constables organizing a search grid echoed across the rail yards. They had maybe 2 minutes before being surrounded completely. "There's someone," Celeste said suddenly, "in Manchester. A journalist who's been investigating the syndicate independently. If we can reach him—" "Then we run to Manchester," Adrian interrupted. "We tell him everything. We become the evidence since we don't have documents. We testify publicly and dare them to kill us in front of witnesses." "That's suicide," Celeste said. "Probably," Adrian agreed. "But what's our alternative? Surrender? Let them win? Let everyone your father died trying to expose continue destroying families for another generation?" He met her eyes, saw the hope flickering back to life behind the devastation. "Your brother disappeared into their machine," Adrian said quietly. "My father built that machine. The only way either of us makes peace with those facts is by dismantling it piece by piece, even if it kills us in the process." Celeste's jaw set. She grabbed his collar and kissed him hard. Not passion, promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear. "Manchester," she said. "Find the journalist. Tell the truth. Burn it all down or die trying." They ran for the trains. They rode to Manchester, hidden inside a textile shipment, buried beneath bolts of raw cotton that smelled like sweat and industrial chemicals. The freight car rattled over tracks for 8 hours straight, while Adrian tried to calculate how many moves ahead Whitmore had been planning. The answer kept coming back the same. All of them. Every contingency. Every backup plan. The old bastard had been orchestrating their downfall since the moment Celeste sent that first note. Celeste lay beside him in the darkness, her breathing shallow. She hadn't spoken since they'd climbed into the freight car. Adrian could feel the devastation radiating off her like heat from a dying fire. 3 years of her life reduced to a pile of worthless newspapers, while the real evidence was probably already burning in Whitmore's fireplace. The train lurched to a stop. Voices outside, dock workers, rail inspectors, the ordinary machinery of commerce that kept the empire functioning. Adrian pressed his finger to Celeste's lips. She nodded. They waited in silence while footsteps passed within inches of their hiding place. Finally, the freight car doors rolled open. Daylight stabbed through the cotton bales. A voice called out in thick Manchester accent, "Textiles for Ramsey and Sons. Get them unloaded before the afternoon shift." They waited until the workers moved to the far end of the car, then slipped out the opposite side. Manchester spread before them. Factories belching smoke, tenement buildings pressed together like teeth in a rotten mouth, streets thick with coal dust and human desperation. London's industrial shadow, where the wealth generated by exploitation was transformed into the goods that made aristocrats comfortable. Adrian's clothes were beyond ruined now. His coat was torn, his shirt stained black with soot and cotton fiber. Celeste looked worse. Her burgundy dress was barely recognizable, her hair wild, her face gaunt from exhaustion and emotional devastation. They looked exactly like what Manchester produced in abundance. Human wreckage. "Where's this journalist?" Adrian asked. "Northern Quarter," Celeste replied, her voice hoarse. "Publishing house called The People's Voice. But we need to approach carefully. If Whitmore anticipated our escape to Manchester—" "He did," Adrian interrupted. "Of course he did. We're walking into another trap." Celeste met his eyes. "Probably. But what choice do we have?" "None." That was the genius of Whitmore's strategy, not to block every path, but to leave only paths that led deeper into the maze. Keep your enemies moving, keep them desperate, keep them making mistakes until they destroyed themselves. They walked through Manchester's working districts with heads down, just 2 more casualties of England's industrial appetite. Nobody looked at them twice. In neighborhoods like this, everyone was running from something: debt, disease, the law, their own past. 2 more refugees barely registered. The People's Voice occupied a narrow building wedged between a butcher shop and a gin house. The ground floor was a printing operation, machinery visible through grimy windows. The smell of ink and hot metal poured into the street. Above, windows showed cramped offices where men hunched over desks, writing the stories the mainstream papers refused to print. Adrian pushed through the front door. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Presses thundering, workers shouting, the organized chaos of getting tomorrow's edition ready. A boy of maybe 12 blocked their path immediately. "No beggars," the boy said flatly. "Editor's rules." "We're not beggars," Celeste said. "We need to speak with Jonathan Graves. Tell him Catherine Byrne has information about the Blackthorn Syndicate." The boy's eyes widened slightly. He disappeared up a narrow staircase. Adrian and Celeste stood in the corner, trying to be invisible, while workers streamed past, hauling paper and metal type. Minutes stretched. Adrian's hand stayed near his pistol. Every person who glanced their direction looked like a potential informant. Finally, the boy returned. He gestured for them to follow. They climbed 3 flights of stairs that creaked ominously, emerging into a cramped office that smelled of tobacco and radical politics. Behind a desk buried in papers sat a man in his 40s, thin as a rail, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that had seen too much truth to ever be comfortable again. Jonathan Graves looked up. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something Adrian couldn't quite identify. "Catherine Byrne," Graves said slowly. "And Duke Adrian Blackthorn, England's most wanted fugitive standing in my office during working hours. Either you're the bravest people alive or the stupidest." "We have information," Celeste said, stepping forward. "Everything you've been trying to prove about the aristocratic conspiracy. We can give you testimony, details, confirmation of—" "He already has it," said a voice from behind them. Adrian spun. Standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit, was Margaret, the textile mill owner, the woman who'd betrayed them in London. She looked different now, cleaner, better dressed, more confident, like she'd shed a disguise and was finally showing her real face. "Hello, Catherine," Margaret said. Her voice was almost gentle. "Did you really think I'd just take Whitmore's money and disappear? Did you think that little of me?" Celeste's hands clenched into fists. "You sold us out. You gave them the documents." "I gave them documents," Margaret corrected. "Copies I'd prepared months ago specifically for this scenario, convincing fakes with just enough real information to seem legitimate." She smiled thinly. "The actual evidence is right here. Has been for 2 weeks. I sent it ahead by courier the moment I realized Whitmore's people were closing in." Adrian felt like the floor was tilting. "You were playing them?" Margaret moved into the room. Graves was watching the scene with the intensity of a man watching history unfold. "I've been working with Jonathan for 3 years," Margaret said, "since Catherine first approached me with her father's documents. Did you think one woman with a vendetta could take down an empire? This required infrastructure, networks, people in positions to move evidence without being detected." She crossed to Graves' desk, pulled open a drawer, and removed a leather portfolio. The real one. Adrian recognized it immediately. The worn edges, the specific pattern of water staining. Inside would be his father's signature 83 times. 30 years of documented atrocities. "But if you have the evidence," Adrian said slowly, "why let us think we'd lost it? Why put us through—" "Because we needed to see how Whitmore would react," Graves interrupted, speaking for the first time since Margaret arrived. "We needed him to show his full hand, every resource he'd deploy, every contingency he'd prepared. You two were bait, extremely effective bait." Adrian felt something cold and furious building in his chest. "You used us." "We used you," Margaret confirmed without apology. "The same way the aristocracy has used working people for centuries. The difference is our manipulation serves justice rather than profit." Celeste's voice was dangerously quiet. "My brother. Did you know what happened to him?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Yes. I'm sorry. He was killed by a man named Richard Townsend, one of Whitmore's enforcers. It's documented in the evidence. When this goes public, Townsend will hang for it." "Small comfort," Celeste said, but her voice cracked on the last word. The building shook suddenly, footsteps thundering up the staircase. Multiple sets, moving fast. Graves stood, his hand moving toward a desk drawer. Margaret positioned herself near the window. Adrian drew his pistol. The door crashed open. Not constables this time. Private security, the kind wealthy men hired when they needed violence but couldn't risk official involvement. 6 of them, armed with clubs and revolvers, led by a man Adrian recognized from his father's estate. Davis. head of the Blackthorn family security for 20 years. Your Grace, Davis said. His voice was respectful, but his weapon was level. I'm here to bring you home. I don't have a home anymore, Adrian replied. Your employer made sure of that. Lord Whitmore is your employer too, Davis said. Or have you forgotten that the estate, the title, the fortune, all of it still technically belongs to the Blackthorn Family Trust? All of it still requires your cooperation to access. Adrian hadn't forgotten. The legal structures his father had built were designed to survive individual scandal. Even if Adrian was accused of treason, the family wealth remained intact, held in trusts that couldn't be seized without complex legal proceedings that would take years. Whitmore wants to make a deal, Davis continued. You sign over control of the estate to him as trustee. In exchange, all charges are dropped. Catherine Byrne receives a comfortable pension and passage to America. Everyone walks away alive. And the evidence? Graves asked quietly. What evidence? Davis smiled. The documents currently in this office? Forgeries. The testimony of a disgraced duke and a known criminal? Worthless. Without corroboration from sources the public trusts, you have nothing but conspiracy theories. Margaret's hand was still near the window. Adrian noticed her fingers moving slightly. Some kind of signal. To whom? The deal expires in 5 minutes, Davis said. After that, my orders are to eliminate everyone in this room and retrieve the documents by force. Lord Whitmore has been very clear about acceptable losses. Adrian looked at Celeste. She was staring at the portfolio on Graves' desk. The evidence that was supposed to save them, now revealed as just another piece in a game they'd never fully understood. He looked at Margaret, the woman who'd used them as bait. At Graves, the journalist who'd built his career on exposing corruption but was now facing execution for it. Power requires certainty, Adrian's father used to say. The moment you hesitate, you've already lost. 4 minutes, Davis said. Adrian made his choice. He raised his pistol, not at Davis, at the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling, at the paper stacked everywhere, at the building full of flammable materials and revolutionary rhetoric. If the deal expires, Adrian said clearly, I burn this building to the ground, all of us inside it, along with every piece of evidence against the syndicate. You're bluffing, Davis said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Adrian's smile felt like his face was cracking. Ask yourself if you know me well enough to be certain. Ask yourself what a man has left to lose when he's already destroyed his own life. The standoff stretched. Outside, Manchester continued its industrial symphony. Inside, 6 armed men faced 3 revolutionaries, 1 disgraced duke, and enough evidence to topple an empire. All of it one spark away from becoming ash. Then Margaret threw something through the window, a small object that arced into the street below. 2 seconds later, bells began ringing. Fire bells. The universal alarm that brought entire neighborhoods running with buckets and fear. False alarm, Margaret said calmly. But by the time they figure that out, this street will be packed with witnesses. Will you massacre an entire publishing house in front of half of Manchester's working population? Davis's jaw clenched. His men shifted nervously. The mathematics of violence had changed. What had been a quiet execution was now a public incident that would raise exactly the questions Whitmore wanted to avoid. This isn't over, Davis said. It never is, Margaret replied. Davis and his men retreated down the stairs. Their footsteps faded beneath the growing noise of the crowd responding to the fire bells. Graves collapsed back into his chair, breathing hard. Margaret closed and locked the door. Adrian lowered his weapon. His hand was shaking. Celeste was staring at Margaret with an expression somewhere between admiration and fury. You planned that too, Celeste said. The fire bells, the witnesses, all of it. Contingencies, Margaret replied. I've been preparing for this confrontation for 3 years. Did you think I'd leave any outcome to chance? She crossed to the desk, picked up the portfolio. Inside this case is enough evidence to prosecute 17 families. But prosecution requires more than documents. It requires public pressure. It requires people angry enough to demand justice, regardless of what the aristocracy wants. So what now? Adrian asked. Now we publish, Graves said. Tomorrow's edition. Front page? Everything. Names, dates, crimes, documentation. We print 50,000 copies and distribute them before Whitmore can get an injunction. By noon tomorrow, every worker in Manchester will know exactly which families built their fortunes on blood and theft. And after that? Celeste asked. After that, Margaret said, we survived the response. Because they won't accept this quietly. They'll use every resource, every connection, every weapon at their disposal to suppress the truth. People will die. Probably us. But at least the information will be public. At least the fight will be visible. Adrian looked at the portfolio, his father's signature. 83 times. 30 years of coordinated evil now about to be exposed to daylight. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt exhausted, hollow, like he'd climbed a mountain only to discover there was another mountain behind it, taller and more treacherous. There's something else, Graves said quietly. He pulled a different document from his desk. This arrived this morning, special courier from London. He handed it to Adrian. It was a letter, written in elegant script on expensive paper. Adrian recognized the handwriting immediately. Lord Whitmore. He read aloud, My dear Adrian, by the time you read this, you will have reached Manchester and discovered that your revolution has been anticipated at every turn. You will feel clever for surviving this long. You will believe that exposing the syndicate is a victory, but allow me to offer a final education in power. Adrian's voice caught. He forced himself to continue. The documents you possess prove crimes committed by 17 families. What they don't prove is who currently controls those families' assets. Over the past decade, I have systematically acquired controlling interests in 12 of the 17 estates through shell companies and proxy ownership. When your evidence becomes public, those families will indeed fall. Their titles will be revoked, their fortunes seized, and I, as an outside party who bravely assisted in their exposure, will purchase their remaining assets at bankruptcy prices. Within 5 years, I will control more wealth and influence than the entire syndicate ever did. You won't have destroyed the empire, Adrian. You will have consolidated it under single ownership. Mine. The letter continued. As for your personal fate, I genuinely hope you survive. I hope you live long enough to watch your heroic revolution create exactly the tyranny you sought to destroy. I hope you understand that the only thing more dangerous than organized corruption is the vacuum left when you tear it down without understanding what will replace it. With sincere regards, Lord Whitmore. The room was silent. Outside, the false fire alarm was being sorted out, crowds dispersing, reality reasserting itself. Inside, 4 people stared at the evidence that was supposed to save England and realized they might be handing the country to something worse. He's been planning this for years, Celeste whispered. While we were gathering evidence, he was positioning himself to profit from it. Adrian felt something breaking inside him, not his resolve, something deeper. The last remnant of belief that the world operated on comprehensible rules. Whitmore hadn't tried to stop them because he didn't need to. He'd built a trap where every move toward justice actually served his consolidation of power. Do we still publish? Graves asked. Margaret was staring out the window at Manchester's industrial landscape. If we don't publish, the syndicate continues operating as it has for decades. If we do publish, we might hand everything to Whitmore. She turned back to them. Either way, ordinary people keep suffering. The only difference is which aristocrat profits from their misery. There has to be another option, Celeste said, but her voice lacked conviction. Adrian read the letter again, looked for weaknesses, found only the brutal logic of a man who'd been playing a longer game than anyone realized. Whitmore had let them think they were hunters when they'd always been prey, had let them think they were exposing corruption when they were actually facilitating a corporate takeover dressed as justice. We publish anyway, Adrian said finally. Everyone looked at him. Even with knowing it serves Whitmore's interests? Graves asked. Especially knowing that, Adrian replied, because the alternative is silence. The alternative is letting the syndicate continue while we sit on evidence out of fear that exposing them benefits someone else. At least this way, the truth is public. At least people know what was done in their name. What they do with that information isn't our decision. He stood, feeling decades older than he had this morning. Maybe Whitmore wins. Maybe he consolidates power exactly as he plans. But he'll do it in the light now, with everyone watching. He'll have to maintain the pretense of legitimacy. That's something. Not much, but something. Celeste touched his arm. You're choosing to burn down your world even knowing a worse one might take its place. Yes, Adrian said. Because the world I came from deserved burning, regardless of what rises from the ashes. Because my father's legacy doesn't deserve protection, even if destroying it empowers Whitmore. Because some structures need to fall even if we can't control what grows in the rubble. Margaret nodded slowly. Then we publish. Tomorrow morning. And we prepare for the response. Graves began organizing pages, selecting which documents would make the front page. Margaret drafted the editorial that would frame the evidence. Celeste sat in the corner, holding the letter from Whitmore, reading it over and over like she was studying a foreign language. Adrian walked to the window, looked out at Manchester. Somewhere in this city, workers were building the goods that made aristocrats wealthy. Somewhere, children were laboring in factories their bodies weren't developed enough to survive. Somewhere, families were starving while nobles debated which wine paired best with venison. The evidence in this office wouldn't save them. Might make their lives worse if Whitmore's consolidation proved more efficient than the syndicate's distributed cruelty. But at least the lies would be exposed. At least people would know the truth of what had been done to them. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even close to justice. But it was all Adrian had left to offer. The night fell. They worked by lamplight, preparing tomorrow's edition. The People's Voice would print the truth at dawn. And by afternoon, the Empire would learn that its foundation was corruption documented in 83 signatures, 30 years of coordinated evil, and one duke's testimony that would destroy his name while possibly empowering something worse. Outside, Manchester slept. Inside, 4 revolutionaries prepared to burn down a system without knowing what system would replace it. And in London, Lord Whitmore probably smiled, having anticipated even this moment of doubt, having prepared for the exact outcome they'd deliver by trying to do the right thing. Adrian understood now why his father had chosen corruption. It was simpler, clearer. You knew what you were building because you controlled every variable. Revolution was chaos. It destroyed targets but couldn't guarantee what emerged from destruction. It required faith that something better would eventually grow, even when all evidence suggested that power simply transferred to whoever was patient enough to wait in the shadows. Faith. That's what this came down to. Not evidence, not planning, just faith that exposure mattered. The truth had value even when it served tyrants. That transparency was worth pursuing even when you couldn't control its consequences. Adrian had lost his estate, his title, his identity as a duke. He'd gained this, a cramped office in Manchester, preparing to publish evidence that might doom England to a worse tyranny than the one it suffered under. Some trade, but it was the only trade available. And he'd make it. Tomorrow morning, when the presses started rolling, when the truth became public, when Lord Whitmore's trap snapped shut exactly as planned. The evidence was ready, the editorial was written, the printing plates were prepared. In 6 hours, the People's Voice would tell England what its aristocracy had been doing for 3 decades. And Adrian Blackthorne, former Duke of Thornbury, would finally pay the full price for his father's sins. He just hoped the payment was worth what it cost everyone else. The presses started rolling at 4 in the morning. Adrian stood beside the machinery, feeling the vibrations travel through the floor and into his bones. Each thump was another copy of the truth being hammered into existence. Each revolution of the press was another nail in the syndicate's coffin, or his own. Probably both. Graves supervised the operation with the intensity of a general watching troops deploy for a battle they couldn't win but had to fight anyway. Margaret coordinated the distribution network, street vendors, rail couriers, sympathetic shopkeepers who'd agreed to display the edition in their windows. Celeste sat in the corner reviewing the final proof copy, her finger tracing the lines that detailed her brother's murder like she was reading scripture written in blood. 50,000 copies, Graves said, raising his voice over the machinery. By noon, every worker in Manchester knows the truth. By evening, London hears. By tomorrow, the Empire starts eating itself. Or Whitmore consolidates everything exactly as planned, Adrian replied. Don't forget that possibility. Graves wiped ink from his hands. You still think we're making a mistake? Adrian watched another 100 newspapers slide off the press, still warm from the rollers. I think we're making the only choice we have. Whether that's a mistake depends on factors we can't control. The machinery thundered. Outside, Manchester was beginning to wake. Soon the streets would fill with workers heading to factories, merchants opening shops. The ordinary circulation of an industrial city that had no idea its morning paper would detonate the foundation of English nobility. First delivery, a courier shouted, bursting through the door. We've got problems. Everyone turned. The courier was bleeding from a cut above his eye, his jacket torn. They're blocking the major roads. Whitmore's people. Private security everywhere. They're confiscating papers from street vendors, threatening publishers, bribing dock workers to refuse shipments. Margaret's expression hardened. How many distribution points are compromised? Maybe half, the courier said. The ones we expected. But they're moving faster than anticipated, more coordinated, like they had the distribution map ahead of time. Adrian felt cold certainty settle in his gut. They did have it. Of course they did. Whitmore had been 3 moves ahead since the beginning. Why would that change now? We used the backup routes, Margaret said immediately. The ones I didn't share with anyone. She looked at Graves. How fast can you print another 20,000? 6 hours, Graves replied. Maybe 5 if we run double shifts. Do it. Margaret was already moving toward the door. I'll handle distribution personally. If Whitmore wants to play logistics warfare, let's see how his private army handles a citywide guerrilla campaign. She paused at the doorway. Catherine. Adrian, you should leave Manchester, now, while the chaos provides cover. And go where? Celeste asked. Every constable in England has our descriptions. Every rail station is being watched. We're trapped. Then we make our stand here, Adrian said. His voice sounded calmer than he felt. We stay and we testify publicly. Force Whitmore to silence us in front of witnesses or accept that the evidence is legitimate. That's suicide, Graves said flatly. Probably, Adrian agreed. But it's suicide with purpose. Better than dying while running. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. There's a political rally tonight. City Square. Workers organizing for factory reforms. 10,000 people expected. If you testify there, in front of that crowd, Whitmore can't disappear you quietly. He can try, Celeste said. He will try, Margaret corrected. But at least you'll be visible. At least people will see what happens to those who expose the truth. Sometimes the martyrdom is more valuable than the survival. She left. The courier followed. Adrian and Celeste were alone except for Graves and his workers, all of them moving with the frantic energy of people who knew time was running out. Adrian crossed to where Celeste sat. She looked up at him with eyes that had aged decades in the past 3 days. Everything we've done, she said quietly. Every sacrifice, every risk, and we still might just be pawns in Whitmore's game. Adrian sat beside her. There's a difference between being used and being defeated. We're definitely being used, but we're not defeated until we accept that the game is the only reality that matters. Philosophy, Celeste said. That's your response? Philosophy? What else do we have? Adrian gestured at the newspapers piling up around them. We tried evidence. We tried exposure. We tried revolution. And the man we're fighting has already absorbed all of it into his strategy. So yes, philosophy is what's left. The decision that even if Whitmore wins the game, we don't have to play by his rules for what winning means. Celeste picked up one of the newspapers. Front page headline screamed, Aristocratic Conspiracy Exposed. 30 years of documented corruption. Below it, her brother's name appeared in a list of victims. Thomas Byrne, age 14, murdered by syndicate enforcer Richard Townsend. My brother didn't get to choose philosophy, Celeste said. He got a bullet and an unmarked grave. No, Adrian agreed. He didn't. But his death is documented now, public. His murder isn't a secret anymore. That's not justice, but it's something. It's a marker that he existed and that his death mattered enough for someone to remember. Celeste's hands trembled. If we die tonight... When we die tonight, Adrian corrected gently. When we die tonight, she continued, what will our marker say? Adrian thought about that, about his father's estate burning behind them, about the opera house turned to ash, about a revolution that might just consolidate tyranny under new management, about 2 people who'd tried to dismantle an empire and had probably only succeeded in making it more efficient. It'll say we tried, Adrian said finally. It'll say that when we saw evil documented in 83 signatures, we didn't look away. That's not much. But it's more than most people manage. The presses continued their relentless rhythm. Dawn light started bleeding through the windows. Manchester was fully awake now. Somewhere out there, workers were reading about the conspiracy that had stolen their labor and their lives. Somewhere, aristocrats were realizing their crimes had been exposed. Somewhere, Whitmore was orchestrating the response that would determine whether truth or power won this particular battle. Adrian knew which one usually won, but he also knew that sometimes the losing side was the only one worth fighting for. By noon, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything Adrian had anticipated. The newspapers made it to maybe a third of their intended distribution before Whitmore's forces shut down the remaining networks. But that third was enough. Word spread through Manchester's working districts like fire through dry timber. By the time Adrian and Celeste ventured into the streets, crowds were already forming. Angry crowds. Confused crowds. Crowds that had just learned the empire they'd been serving was built on systematic theft and murder. Adrian could feel the fury radiating from them, raw and dangerous and looking for targets. They made their way toward the city square, where the rally would happen. The streets were chaos. Constables trying to maintain order while workers demanded answers, vendors shouting about the newspaper expose, arguments erupting into fistfights that spread like contagion through the crowds. Adrian kept his head down and his hand on Celeste's arm. They'd acquired working-class clothes from Margaret's network, rough wool, poorly fitted, the costume of invisibility in industrial England. But invisibility only worked if nobody looked too closely. "That's him!" someone shouted. Adrian's blood turned to ice. He looked up. A man was pointing directly at him, his face twisted with recognition. "That's the Duke, the one from the paper." Blackthorn. The crowd's attention swiveled, dozens of eyes locking onto Adrian and Celeste. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone threw a bottle. It shattered against the cobblestones 2 feet from where Adrian stood. "Murder!" a woman screamed. "You killed that minister! Burn down the opera house!" "We didn't," Celeste shouted back. "Read the evidence. We're trying to expose the real killers." But the crowd wasn't interested in evidence. They were interested in targets. Years of exploitation and stolen wages and dead family members had created a reservoir of rage that needed somewhere to go. Adrian represented everything they hated, and the fact that he was trying to destroy that system didn't matter. He was still marked by privilege, still carried the stink of aristocracy, still looked like the enemy. "Run," Adrian said to Celeste. They ran. The crowd surged after them. Adrian pulled Celeste down a side alley, then another, trying to shake pursuit. Behind them, voices echoed and multiplied, more people joining the hunt, the mob growing with every block. They emerged onto a broader street and nearly collided with a constable patrol. The officer in charge took one look at Adrian's face and reached for his whistle. Adrian didn't think, just moved. He grabbed the officer's arm, twisted, sent him sprawling. Then he and Celeste were running again, with both the crowd and the law behind them now. "This is what Whitmore wanted," Celeste gasped as they ran. "Turn the workers against us. Make us the enemy instead of him." Adrian didn't have breath to respond. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. Behind them, the pursuit was organized now. Whistles blowing, voices coordinating. They were being herded toward something. Adrian could feel it, the way the streets kept narrowing, the way certain paths were blocked while others remained open. Classic hunting tactics. Drive the prey toward the kill zone. They burst into the city square and stopped. The square was filled with people, thousands of them, workers who'd come for the reform rally. But at the center, on the raised platform where speeches were supposed to happen, stood Lord Whitmore. He was flanked by private security and several men in expensive clothes who Adrian recognized as other syndicate members. Behind them, a contingent of constables formed a perimeter. "Welcome, Adrian," Whitmore called out. His voice carried across the square, amplified by the silence that had fallen when Adrian and Celeste appeared. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it." The crowd parted. Not by choice, they were pushed aside by more security forces appearing from surrounding buildings. Adrian and Celeste were channeled forward toward the platform, trapped by human walls on all sides. Adrian's hand moved toward his pistol. Whitmore smiled. "I wouldn't," Whitmore said. "My men have orders to fire into the crowd if you draw that weapon. 10,000 workers as hostages. Quite effective leverage, wouldn't you say?" Adrian's hand fell away from the gun. He and Celeste were pushed forward until they stood at the base of the platform, looking up at Whitmore like subjects before a throne. "You've caused quite a disruption," Whitmore continued, addressing the crowd now. "This man and his accomplice have spread vicious lies about England's noble families. They've manufactured evidence, incited violence, murdered a government minister, and now they stand before you, hoping you'll protect them from justice." "That's a lie," Celeste shouted. "We have documentation, proof of 30 years of conspiracy." "Proof?" Whitmore repeated mockingly. He produced a document from his coat. "You mean this confession, signed by Duke Adrian Blackthorne, admitting to blackmail, forgery, and murder? Quite damning testimony against yourself, I must say." Adrian felt the trap closing. That confession was the one Whitmore had mentioned earlier, the false one he'd prepared. But to this crowd, with no context and no reason to trust anyone with aristocratic blood, it would seem legitimate. "I never signed that," Adrian said, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd's reaction. Confusion. Anger. The mob's uncertainty about who to believe and who to destroy. Whitmore raised his hand for silence. "Got it. However, I am a merciful man. Despite your crimes, I'm willing to offer one final chance at redemption." He gestured to his men. They dragged forward a third figure Adrian hadn't noticed before. Margaret. She was bound and bloodied, her face swollen from recent violence. Her eyes met Adrian's. In them he saw apology and defiance mixed in equal measure. "This woman," Whitmore announced, "is the real architect of your conspiracy." Margaret Thompson, former textile mill owner, current revolutionary agitator. She forged the documents you've been reading. She manipulated Duke Blackthorne and Catherine Byrne into serving as her unwitting accomplices. She murdered Minister Sheffield when he discovered her plot. The lies came smooth as silk, each one building on the last, creating a narrative the crowd could understand. Working class, radical, manipulating, naive aristocrats. It absolved the nobility while giving the workers a villain from their own ranks to destroy. Brilliant strategy. Monstrous, but brilliant. "Confess," Whitmore told Margaret. "Tell them the truth." Margaret spat blood. "The truth is you're a disease wearing a suit. The truth is one of Whitmore's men hit her, hard enough that she collapsed to her knees. The crowd murmured. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, hungry for violence. "Confess," Whitmore repeated, "or I'll have you hanged right here, right now, in front of everyone." Margaret raised her head, met Adrian's eyes again, and smiled. It was the most defiant expression Adrian had ever seen, pure resistance in human form. "Do it," Margaret said. "Hang me. Let everyone see what happens to women who fight back. Let them see the violence you're willing to commit to protect your power. That's better testimony than any confession." Whitmore's expression flickered, just for a moment, the calculation showing through the mask. He'd wanted Margaret to break, wanted the crowd to see a revolutionary revealed as a fraud. Instead, he was about to create a martyr. "Very well," Whitmore said. He nodded to his men. They moved to erect a gallows, not a permanent structure, but a simple beam and rope. They'd prepared for this scenario. Of course they had. Adrian's mind raced. Margaret was about to die. Celeste was trapped beside him. The crowd was moments away from either riot or complicity. And Whitmore was orchestrating all of it like a conductor managing symphony. This was the moment. The only moment that mattered. Everything before had been preparation. Everything after would be consequence. Right now, Adrian had to decide what kind of man he actually was when stripped of title and options and the comfortable distance that came with aristocratic privilege. He thought about his father, about 83 signatures authorizing atrocities, about a legacy built on other people's suffering, about the choice to inherit evil or destroy it even when destruction accomplished nothing except honesty. Adrian stepped forward. "Stop." The word cut through the noise. Whitmore looked down at him. Around them, the crowd held its breath. "You want a confession?" Adrian said clearly. "I'll give you one. My father was a criminal. He participated in a conspiracy that stole from the poor and murdered anyone who threatened to expose it. I inherited his fortune. I benefited from his crimes. For 30 years, I lived off blood money and pretended it was legitimate." The crowd was silent now, absolutely silent. Adrian could hear his own heartbeat. And 3 days ago, I learned the full extent of what he'd done, what I'd been complicit in through ignorance and comfort. So yes, I tried to expose it. Yes, I worked with Catherine Byrne and Margaret Thompson. And yes, Lord Whitmore is now trying to silence us because the evidence we gathered proves he's been positioning himself to absorb the syndicate's power rather than destroy it. Adrian pulled the pistol from his coat, aimed it, Not at Whitmore. At himself. Press the barrel against his own temple. So here's my offer, Adrian continued. Release Margaret. Let the evidence be distributed without interference. Allow independent investigation into the syndicate's crimes. Do that, and I'll pull this trigger right now. Give you the martyr you want. Let you spin whatever narrative serves your purposes. One life for the truth. Fair trade. Celeste grabbed his arm. Adrian, don't. Let go, Adrian said quietly. This is the only card we have left to play. The square was frozen. 10,000 people watching a duke hold a gun to his own head while threatening the most powerful lord in England. Whitmore's face was unreadable. Calculating. The gun in Adrian's hand was steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. You're bluffing, Whitmore said finally. Adrian pulled back the hammer. The mechanical click echoed across the square. Am I? You've been right about everything else. Have you been right about whether I have the courage to follow through? The standoff stretched. Seconds felt like hours. Adrian's finger was on the trigger. One twitch, and everything ended. His problems. His guilt. His desperate attempt to redeem a legacy that couldn't be redeemed. But it would also end Whitmore's control over this moment. Would create chaos the Lord couldn't manage. Whitmore raised his hand slightly. His men tensed. Release the woman, Whitmore said. They cut Margaret's bonds. She collapsed forward, gasping. Celeste moved to help her up. Adrian kept the gun pressed against his temple. And the evidence, Adrian prompted. Will be investigated, Whitmore said. Though I assure you, proper investigation will reveal most of it as cleverly constructed forgery. Then we'll let the investigators decide, Adrian replied. Independent ones. Not the judges you've bought. Whitmore's smile was cold. You've won nothing here, you realize that? This gesture changes nothing. The syndicate falls, I rise. Your martyrdom is just street theater. Maybe, Adrian said. But it's theater in front of 10,000 witnesses. Whatever happens next, they'll remember this. They'll remember that the establishment was willing to hang a woman for exposing corruption. They'll remember you had to be threatened into allowing investigation. Memory is a weapon too. He lowered the gun. Slowly. His hand was shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. Celeste moved beside him, her hand on his arm, steady, present. The crowd remained silent, watching, waiting to see what came next. Whitmore looked at them, looked at Adrian, and smiled one more time. This isn't over, Whitmore said quietly. This has barely begun. He gestured to his men. They retreated from the platform. The constables held their positions but didn't advance. The crowd began to stir, voices rising, arguments starting. The careful control Whitmore had established was fracturing. Adrian, Margaret said. Her voice was raw. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both, Adrian replied, bowing. Celeste pulled him away from the platform. The crowd was getting restless. Some wanted justice, some wanted violence, some just wanted to go home. The moment was collapsing into chaos that neither Whitmore nor Adrian could control anymore. They moved through the crowd with Margaret between them. People stared. Some reached out to touch Adrian's coat like he was a saint or a ghost. Others spat at his feet. Most just watched with expressions that mixed confusion and anger and something that might have been hope. They reached the edge of the square, a narrow street leading back toward the printing house. Behind them, Whitmore was already reorganizing his forces, already adapting to this new reality, already planning the next move in a game Adrian had just made infinitely more complicated. We need to get out of Manchester, Margaret said, tonight, before Whitmore decides the agreement doesn't matter. Where do we go? Celeste asked. The question hung in the air. They had no safe houses, no allies they could trust, no money beyond what Margaret had hidden. They were three fugitives in a country where half the population wanted them dead and the other half didn't care. Blackthorn Manor, Adrian said suddenly. Both women stared at him. Your estate? Celeste said. The place Whitmore definitely knows about and certainly has monitored? Yes, Adrian confirmed. But it's also the one place with resources we can use. Weapons, supplies, documents my father might have kept that could corroborate what we've already exposed. And more importantly, it's symbolic. We make our stand at the heart of the corruption. We force the final confrontation on ground that represents everything we're fighting against. That's insane, Margaret said. Adrian looked at both of them. Everything we've done has been insane. Running to Manchester was insane. Publishing the evidence was insane. Threatening to kill myself in the city square was insane. We're past the point where sanity matters. All that matters now is whether we finish this fight or spend the rest of our short lives running from it. Celeste was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Blackthorn Manor, tonight. We end this where it started. Margaret shook her head, but didn't argue. They moved through Manchester's streets as the city descended into afternoon chaos. Riots were starting in the working districts. Constables were overwhelmed. The careful social order that kept England functioning was cracking under the weight of exposed truth. By the time they reached the rail yards, fires were burning in 3 parts of the city. The revolution they'd tried to start was happening, but without direction, without leadership, just pure rage looking for targets. Whitmore would use this, would declare martial law, would position himself as the stabilizing force that saved England from chaos. Unless Adrian stopped him first. They boarded a freight train heading south, hidden again in cargo shipments, running again toward confrontation. The train pulled out of Manchester as the sun started setting. Behind them, smoke rose from burning buildings. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, Blackthorn Manor waited. The estate where Adrian's father had signed his name 83 times. Where the conspiracy had been nurtured and protected for 3 decades. Where, tomorrow night, Whitmore would come to finish what he'd started. And where Adrian would either find redemption through destruction or die proving that some legacies deserved nothing but fire. The train raced through the English countryside. Inside the freight car, 3 revolutionaries prepared for the battle they'd been fighting since the moment Celeste sent that first note to the opera house. The battle that had cost them everything and might cost them more before it ended. Adrian looked at Celeste in the darkness. She was holding the newspaper with her brother's name printed on the victims list, holding it like a promise she intended to keep. Whatever happens tomorrow, Adrian said quietly, I'm glad it was you who destroyed my world. Celeste met his eyes. I'm glad you let me. The train continued south, toward Blackthorn Manor, toward the final confrontation, toward whatever ending had been inevitable since the moment Adrian chose truth over inheritance. Behind them, England burned. Ahead, Whitmore was already moving pieces into position for the endgame. And between them was nothing but darkness, velocity, and the terrible certainty that tomorrow would answer every question they'd been asking since this began. Whether that answer looked like justice or just more sophisticated tyranny remained to be seen. Blackthorn Manor appeared through the morning fog like a ghost of everything Adrian had spent his life becoming. The estate sprawled across 200 acres of manicured English countryside. Gardens his mother had designed before consumption took her, stables where his father had kept horses worth more than most families earned in lifetimes. The great house itself with its 40 rooms and 3 centuries of accumulated aristocratic certainty. Adrian had been born in the East Wing, had learned to walk in the portrait gallery where generations of Blackthorns stared down with expressions that suggested they'd never doubted their right to exist exactly as they were. Now he was returning as an invader to his own inheritance. The freight train had dropped them 10 miles north at dawn. They'd walked the rest through countryside Adrian knew better than his own heartbeat. Every hill, every stream, every tenant farm that had paid rent to his family for generations. The land looked different now, not because it had changed, but because Adrian had. He saw the fields and understood for the first time that the wheat growing there had been planted by people his father had systematically exploited. That the forest had been preserved not for beauty, but for hunting parties where deals were made and conspiracies were nurtured between shots of expensive whiskey. Margaret walked beside him, still favoring her left side from the beating Whitmore's men had delivered. Celeste moved ahead, scouting the approaches with the caution of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to survive in spaces that wanted her dead. The pistol Adrian carried felt heavier with each step closer to the manor, not because of its weight, because of what it represented. The willingness to use violence against people he'd once called colleagues, maybe friends. Definitely the only social structure he'd ever known. There's movement in the East Wing, Celeste said, dropping back from her forward position. At least a dozen men, armed. Whitmore's not taking chances. Adrian studied the manor through a gap in the hedgerow. His father had designed the estate's defenses during the Napoleonic Wars. Sight lines that allowed defenders to see approaching threats, walls thick enough to stop musket fire, underground passages that connected the main house to outlying buildings. All of it built on the assumption that threats came from outside. from foreign armies or peasant revolts or rival families trying to seize power. None of it designed to stop someone who'd grown up learning every secret the estate contained. "There's a tunnel," Adrian said. "Runs from the old wine cellar to the stable master's cottage. My father used it to move contraband during import restrictions. If Whitmore's men don't know about it, we can enter the house unseen." "And if they do know?" Margaret asked. "Then we die somewhere between the cottage and the cellar," Adrian replied. "But we were going to die anyway. This just determines the location." They circled wide through the forest, approaching the cottage from the blind side. The structure was small, 2 rooms where the stable master had lived until he'd died of pneumonia, and Adrian's father had decided the position wasn't worth replacing. The door hung open. Inside, dust coated everything except a single set of footprints leading to the trapdoor Adrian remembered from childhood explorations. "Fresh tracks," Celeste observed. "Someone's been using this tunnel recently." Adrian knelt beside the trapdoor, examined the edges. The dust had been disturbed in patterns that suggested multiple trips over several days. Whitmore knew. Of course he knew. He'd probably had people combing the estate for weeks, mapping every entrance and exit, preparing for exactly this scenario. "It's still our best option," Adrian said. "The main entrances will be fortified. This tunnel at least gives us a chance to reach the interior before they realize we're inside." Margaret checked her revolver, a weapon she'd acquired during their flight from Manchester, though Adrian didn't ask how. "We go in shooting? We go in quiet," Adrian corrected. "We're not trying to fight Whitmore's entire force. We're trying to reach my father's study." That's where he kept his private records. The documents he never shared with the syndicate because he didn't trust them any more than they trusted him. If those papers still exist, they'll prove Whitmore's consolidation scheme. Show that he's been planning this takeover for years. "And then what?" Celeste asked. "We've already exposed the syndicate. Another pile of documents won't change anything if Whitmore controls the investigation." "No," Adrian agreed, "but it changes the narrative. Right now, Whitmore's positioning himself as the reformer who's cleaning up corruption. If we prove he was part of it from the beginning, that he orchestrated Sheffield's murder specifically to create the chaos he's now exploiting, that transforms him from savior to architect. The public might forgive one. They won't forgive both." He pulled open the trapdoor. Darkness yawned below, smelling of earth and centuries of accumulated damp. A ladder descended into absolute black. Adrian lit the oil lamp they'd brought from the printing house. The flame guttered in the stale air but held. "Stay close," Adrian said. "If shooting starts, don't stop moving until you reach the cellar." They descended one at a time. Adrian first, then Celeste, then Margaret. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to move through without turning sideways. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls were rough stone that scraped clothing and skin. Every sound echoed in ways that made it impossible to tell if they were alone or if someone was waiting ahead in the darkness. Adrian moved forward with the lamp held high. The tunnel stretched for what felt like miles but was probably only 200 yards. His breath came short in the confined space. Beside him, Celeste's breathing was controlled but rapid. Behind, Margaret's footsteps were uneven from her injuries. They reached a junction, 3 passages branching in different directions. Adrian paused, trying to remember the layout from childhood. His father had shown him these tunnels once, explaining they were Blackthorne family secrets that should never be shared with outsiders. At the time, Adrian had thought it was about protecting family history. Now he understood it was about maintaining infrastructure for criminal activity. "Left passage leads to the wine cellar," Adrian said. "Center goes to the chapel basement. Right connects to the servants' quarters." "Wine cellar," Celeste confirmed. "That's our target." Adrian led them left. The passage narrowed further. The lamp's glow barely penetrated the oppressive dark. Adrian's hand trailed along the wall, feeling for the marker he remembered. A series of carved notches his grandfather had made to count successful smuggling runs. He found them. 37 notches. 37 times his family had broken laws they were supposed to uphold. The passage ended at an iron door secured with a lock that looked newer than the surrounding stone. Someone had replaced it recently. Adrian examined the mechanism. Quality work. Expensive. Not something you installed unless you were planning to use this entrance regularly. "Can you pick it?" Margaret whispered. Adrian produced a set of tools from his coat, another acquisition from Margaret's network. He'd never picked a lock before. Had never needed to. Aristocrats used keys or simply ordered doors opened, but he'd watched enough of his father's less reputable associates to understand the basic principles. He worked for 5 minutes that felt like hours. The mechanism resisted. His hands shook. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Behind him, Celeste and Margaret stood in silence, broken only by their breathing and the distant sound of water moving through pipes somewhere in the manor's infrastructure. Finally, something clicked. The lock released. Adrian pulled the door open slowly, expecting gunfire or shouting or immediate confrontation. Instead, silence. And beyond it, the wine cellar his father had maintained with more care than he'd shown his own son. They entered. The cellar was exactly as Adrian remembered. Rows of bottles organized by region and vintage, temperature maintained by the underground location, everything labeled with his father's meticulous handwriting. Thousands of pounds worth of wine that would probably be seized by the Crown once Whitmore's investigation concluded. Unless Whitmore arranged to purchase it himself at bankruptcy prices. The stairs leading up to the main house were visible at the far end. Unlocked. Waiting. Adrian extinguished the lamp. They moved through darkness now, guided only by the faint light bleeding down from above. At the top of the stairs, Adrian paused, listened. The house was occupied. He could feel it in the way old buildings broadcast human presence through subtle vibrations and air pressure changes. Voices somewhere distant, footsteps on upper floors. The estate was alive with Whitmore's men preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming. "The study is on the second floor," Adrian whispered. "East wing. We'll need to cross the main hall and take the service staircase. If we're lucky, most of Whitmore's forces are watching the perimeter." "And if we're not lucky?" Margaret asked. "Then we adapt," Adrian replied. They emerged into the ground floor corridor. The manor's interior was as Adrian remembered, but felt foreign now, like visiting a museum dedicated to his own past. Portrait of his grandfather, tapestry his mother had commissioned, furniture that had witnessed generations of Blackthorns making decisions that shaped England while convincing themselves they were serving something larger than personal ambition. They moved through this corridor with weapons drawn, past the drawing room where Adrian had learned to play chess, past the library where his father had taught him that power came from understanding what people wanted and being willing to provide it at a price they couldn't refuse. Every room was a memory transformed into evidence of systemic corruption. The main hall opened before them, grand staircase rising to the second floor, chandelier that had cost enough to feed a village for a year, and standing at the base of the stairs, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment, was Lord Whitmore. He was alone, no guards visible, just the old lord in his expensive coat, leaning casually against the banister like he was greeting guests at a social function rather than confronting armed fugitives in a house he didn't own. "Adrian?" Whitmore said pleasantly. "Catherine." "Margaret. I'm so glad you made it. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Adrian raised his pistol. Whitmore didn't flinch. "You're not going to shoot me," Whitmore said. "Not yet. You still hope there's a way to win this that doesn't involve murder. That's always been your weakness, this persistent belief that moral superiority matters more than effective action." "The study," Adrian said. "Let us pass." "Of course," Whitmore replied, stepping aside with an elaborate gesture. "Please, take whatever documents you think will help. I've already removed anything truly incriminating. What remains are just your father's personal papers. Journals, correspondence, the pathetic attempt at legacy building that every wealthy man engages in when he realizes his fortune can't buy immortality." He smiled. It was the expression of someone who'd already won and was just watching the final moves play out. "You killed Sheffield," Celeste said. "You orchestrated the entire conspiracy we exposed, and now you're positioning yourself as the solution to problems you created." "Guilty on all counts," Whitmore confirmed cheerfully. "Except the part where it matters. Because I'm still going to win. You'll reach the study. You'll find your father's papers. You might even discover evidence of my involvement, and it won't change anything, because the narrative is already established. The syndicate is corrupt. I'm the reformer. Your testimony is the desperate accusation of a disgraced duke and his criminal accomplice." Adrian felt something sharp and clear crystallizing in his mind. Not rage. Understanding. Whitmore had constructed a game where every move served his interests, where exposure strengthened his position, where resistance was just another form of compliance with his larger strategy. But understanding the game didn't mean accepting its rules. "You're right," Adrian said, lowering his weapon. "We can't win by your metrics. Can't outmaneuver you politically or legally or through the channels you control, so we're not going to try." Whitmore's smile faltered slightly. "Excuse me?" Adrian turned to Celeste and Margaret. "Burn it. All of it. The study, the documents, the entire manor. Let it all go to ash." Celeste's eyes widened. "Adrian, this house is a monument to everything corrupt about English aristocracy," Adrian continued. "My father built his fortune here. Whitmore wants to claim it. The syndicate used it as headquarters. It represents 3 centuries of systematic exploitation dressed up as noble heritage. So we remove it from the board, eliminate the prize everyone's fighting over." "That's insane," Margaret said. "The evidence is already public," Adrian interrupted. "The Manchester papers prove the conspiracy exists. Additional documents just add detail. But this house standing represents continuity, suggests the system can survive exposure and keep functioning. Burning it sends a different message, says that some structures deserve nothing but destruction." Whitmore's expression had shifted to something harder. "You destroy your own inheritance? Your family legacy?" "It was never mine," Adrian said. "It was built by people who treated human beings as resources to be extracted. My father signed his name 83 times authorizing atrocities. This house is a mausoleum for victims I never knew but profited from anyway. Burning it is the only honest thing I can do with it." He looked at Whitmore directly. "And it's the one move you didn't anticipate, because you wanted the estate, wanted the legitimacy that comes with owning Blackthorn lands, wanted to sit in my father's study and feel like you'd conquered something. So I'm taking that victory away from you." Whitmore's composure cracked. "You're a fool. That house is worth—" "Nothing to me," Adrian finished. "Less than nothing. It's a debt I can never repay to people I can never make whole. But I can at least stop it from standing as a monument to their suffering." He turned to Celeste. "The study first. We confirm what we're burning. Then we light it and walk away." Celeste studied his face, then nodded. Margaret did the same. They moved toward the staircase. Whitmore didn't try to stop them, just watched with an expression that suggested he was recalculating every assumption he'd made about Adrian's motivations. "You think destruction is redemption?" Whitmore called after them. "You think burning your inheritance makes you noble?" Adrian paused on the stairs. "No, it makes me honest. There's a difference." They climbed to the second floor. Behind them, Whitmore was already shouting orders to his men. "Seal the exits, contain the fire, protect the valuable assets." All the commands of someone trying to salvage victory from a situation that had just stopped making sense, according to his metrics. The study door was unlocked. Inside, nothing had changed since the last time Adrian had entered. 6 months ago, going through his father's papers after the funeral, trying to understand the man who'd raised him with cold efficiency and colder affection. The desk was massive mahogany. The shelves held first editions and rare manuscripts. The safe behind the portrait contained documents his father had valued enough to secure separately. Adrian opened the safe. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, and a leather journal he didn't recognize. He pulled out the journal, opened it to a random page. His father's handwriting filled the margins with notes about syndicate meetings, financial arrangements, and casual observations about people whose lives had been destroyed to maintain profit margins. One entry caught Adrian's attention. It was dated 3 weeks before his father's death. Adrian shows promise, but lacks the necessary ruthlessness. He still believes power should serve purpose beyond self-perpetuation. This weakness will either destroy him or force him to evolve beyond sentiment. "I suspect the former. The Blackthorn line ends with me regardless of whether my son survives." Adrian read it twice. His father's final assessment, a prediction that had almost come true. Would have come true if Adrian hadn't met Celeste, hadn't seen the evidence, hadn't chosen to destroy rather than inherit. He showed the passage to Celeste. She read it silently, then looked at Adrian with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what those words had cost to read. "He was wrong," Celeste said quietly. "The Blackthorn line doesn't end with you. It transforms. You're not your father's son anymore. You're something he couldn't imagine, someone who chose truth over legacy." Adrian closed the journal, placed it back in the safe along with everything else. Then he pulled out matches he'd taken from the printing house. "We burn it all," Adrian said. "Every document, every record, every piece of evidence that anyone could use to continue profiting from my father's crimes. We leave nothing but ash and the memory that this place existed and was rightfully destroyed. Margaret was already dousing the curtains with lamp oil. Celeste gathered papers from the desk and piled them in the center of the room. Adrian struck a match. The flame burned bright and clean in his hand. "For everyone who suffered to build this place," Adrian said. "For everyone who died to maintain it. For everyone who comes after who deserves better than inheriting other people's evil." He dropped the match. The oil caught immediately. Flames spread across the floor with hungry efficiency. The papers ignited. The curtains became walls of fire. Within seconds, the study was an inferno. They ran. Down the hallway as smoke filled the corridors. Down the stairs as the fire climbed walls and consumed portraits of generations of blackthorns who'd convinced themselves their cruelty was justified by breeding. Out through the main entrance as Whitmore's men scrambled to contain flames that had already grown beyond containment. Outside, the morning sun made the fire look almost beautiful, orange and gold consuming 3 centuries of accumulated aristocratic certainty. Adrian stood on the gravel drive watching his inheritance burn. Beside him, Celeste held the newspaper clipping with her brother's name. Margaret watched with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd waited years to see justice take tangible form. Whitmore emerged from the manor carrying documents he'd managed to salvage. His face was soot-stained, his expensive coat ruined. He looked at Adrian with something between fury and grudging respect. "You've destroyed everything," Whitmore said. "Yes," Adrian agreed. "That was the point. The estate is gone. The evidence is compromised. You'll have nothing." "I'll have the truth," Adrian replied. "The public knows the conspiracy exists, knows your involvement, knows the aristocracy built itself on systematic exploitation. This fire just makes the metaphor literal." Whitmore stared at the burning manor. For the first time since Adrian had known him, the old lord looked uncertain. "You think you've won?" "No," Adrian said. "I think I've stopped losing on your terms. There's a difference." The fire department arrived from the village. Too late to save anything meaningful. They sprayed water on the flames, mostly to prevent the fire from spreading to surrounding forests. By noon, Blackthorn Manor was a smoking ruin. By evening, every newspaper in England was running the story with headlines that ranged from "Disgraced Duke Destroys Family Estate" to "Blackthorn Manor Falls in Symbolic End to Aristocratic Corruption." Adrian, Celeste, and Margaret surrendered to authorities that night. They were arrested, charged with arson, held pending investigation into the broader conspiracy. But the arrest was almost gentle. The constables who took them into custody had read the Manchester papers, had seen the evidence, understood that the people they were arresting were either heroes or criminals, depending on which version of justice you believed in. The trial lasted 3 months, the longest and most public corruption investigation in English history. Adrian testified for 6 days straight, detailed every crime his father had participated in, named names, provided context, admitted his own complicity through years of willful ignorance. The prosecution tried to paint him as a blackmailer and murderer. The defense countered with documentary evidence and Margaret's network of witnesses who corroborated the syndicate's existence. In the end, the verdict was complicated. Adrian was convicted of arson but acquitted of murder and blackmail, sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with possibility of parole. Celeste received 3 years. Margaret was released with time served for her cooperation. 17 noble families were stripped of titles and had assets seized. 12 members of the syndicate were convicted of various crimes ranging from fraud to murder. And Lord Whitmore disappeared 2 weeks before he was scheduled to testify. No body was ever found. No trace of where he'd gone, just absence where there had been certainty. Rumors suggested he'd fled to France or America or simply died quietly and been buried by allies who wanted to avoid further scandal. Adrian suspected the man was still alive somewhere, rebuilding power under a different name. But without the Blackthorn estate as his symbolic victory, Whitmore's consolidation scheme had collapsed. The vacuum left by the syndicate's fall was filled not by a single tyrant, but by messy democratic reform that nobody controlled completely. Adrian served 18 months before being paroled for good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. He emerged from prison to find England transformed. Not dramatically, not completely, but changed in ways that suggested the exposure had mattered. Labor reforms were being debated in Parliament. Factory conditions were improving incrementally. The automatic deference to aristocratic authority had weakened enough that people were willing to question inherited power. Small changes. Insufficient changes. But changes nonetheless. Celeste was released the same day. They met at the prison gates. She looked thinner, harder, but also somehow lighter, like a burden she'd carried for years had finally been set down. "What now?" she asked. Adrian looked at the road stretching away from the prison, looked at the woman who'd destroyed his comfortable life and given him an honest one in return. "The Blackthorn lands still exist," Adrian said. "The manor's gone, but the farms remain. Tenant families who've been paying rent to my family for generations. I thought maybe we could change that. Transfer ownership directly to the people who work the land. Turn the estate into something other than extraction." "That'll take years," Celeste observed. "Probably," Adrian agreed. "But I've got time now, and I've learned that you can't undo evil. Can only try to build something better in the space it occupied." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand. "Your father predicted you'd be destroyed by sentiment. He wasn't entirely wrong," Adrian said. "The person I was got destroyed. But something else survived, something that doesn't need the Blackthorn name or the estate or the illusion of noble purpose to justify existing." They walked away from the prison together. Behind them, the institution that had held them closed its gates and resumed its ordinary operations. Ahead, the road led toward what had been Blackthorn lands, toward tenant farms where families were learning that the Duke who'd burned his own manor was now planning to give them the property they'd worked for generations. It would be complicated. Land transfers always were. Legal challenges from distant Blackthorn relatives who believed they deserved inheritance. Resistance from aristocrats who saw Adrian's actions as betrayal of class solidarity, but also support from workers who'd read about the conspiracy and wanted to believe that change was possible. Margaret joined them 3 weeks later. She'd been organizing labor networks, turning the anger generated by the Manchester papers into political pressure for reform. Together, the three of them began the slow work of dismantling one estate's feudal structure and replacing it with something resembling cooperative ownership. It wasn't redemption. Adrian understood that. You didn't redeem stolen fortunes by returning fragments. Didn't absolve generational exploitation by transferring property to the great-grandchildren of your family's victims. But it was honest work, unglamorous, difficult. The kind of labor aristocrats never did because it lacked the grand gestures that could be called nobility. 6 months after his release, Adrian stood on the hill overlooking what had been Blackthorn Manor. The ruins were still visible, blackened stone, collapsed walls, the skeleton of a ballroom where his parents had hosted parties to celebrate wealth built on other people's suffering. Nature was already reclaiming it, vines growing through windows, birds nesting in the chimneys. The slow process of transformation from monument to memory. Celeste found him there, stood beside him looking at the ruins. "You ever regret it?" she asked, "burning it all down?" "Every day," Adrian admitted. "Then I remember my father's journal, his assessment that I lacked necessary ruthlessness, and I realized the only victory I could have over his legacy was proving him wrong about what strength actually means." He turned to face her. Not the strength to exploit, not the strength to maintain power, the strength to choose destruction over inheritance when inheritance means perpetuating evil. That's what he couldn't imagine, that I'd be willing to lose everything rather than keep something built on cruelty. Celeste looked at him with eyes that had seen too much violence and just enough justice to believe it was possible. "Your brother," Adrian said quietly. "Thomas. I can't bring him back, can't undo what was done to him, but his name is public now, his murder is documented. The man who killed him hanged for it. It's not enough, will never be enough. But it's something." "It's everything," Celeste corrected. She pulled out the newspaper clipping she still carried, the victim's list with Thomas's name printed in careful type. For 3 years, he was just gone, erased. Now he exists again. People know he lived, know he mattered, know his death wasn't some random tragedy, but murder committed to protect power. She folded the clipping carefully, placed it back in her pocket. "That's what you gave me. Not justice, not revenge, just acknowledgement. The world seeing what was done and admitting it was wrong." Adrian took her hand. They stood together on the hill overlooking ruins and farmland and a future neither of them could control but both had chosen to participate in. The sun was setting, the light turned the countryside gold. Somewhere down in the valley, Tenant farmers were working land they were learning to own. Somewhere in Manchester, Margaret was organizing the next phase of labor reform. Somewhere in London, Parliament was debating legislation that might make England slightly less cruel to people without titles or fortunes. Small victories, insufficient victories, but victories nonetheless. This isn't how these stories usually end, Celeste observed. The noble hero is supposed to triumph completely. Evil is supposed to be vanquished. Everyone lives happily after. Adrian smiled. It felt genuine for the first time in months. No one who's actually fought power believes those stories. Power doesn't vanquish. It adapts. Whitmore's gone, but someone else will rise. The syndicate fell, but exploitation continues under new management. We didn't save England. We just made it slightly harder for the next generation of bastards to pretend their cruelty is nobility. So what did we accomplish? Adrian thought about that, about the opera house burning, about Manchester erupting into riots, about a trial that exposed decades of conspiracy, about this moment standing on ruins of his inheritance with a woman who'd destroyed and saved him in equal measure. We told the truth, Adrian said finally. In a system built on lies, that's revolution enough. We didn't win, but we made them work harder to maintain the illusion. We created cracks they'll spend years trying to repair. And we proved that people can choose honor over inheritance when honor means destroying everything they were taught to protect. The sun continued its descent. The ruins continued their slow transformation into landscape. And two people who'd survived their own reckoning stood together watching the day end, knowing that tomorrow would bring new battles against systems they couldn't defeat, but refused to stop fighting. Because that's what remained after empire burned away. Not victory, but persistence. Not justice, but the choice to keep working toward it anyway. Not redemption, but the daily decision to build something honest from the wreckage of inherited evil. Adrian Blackthorne had been a duke once, had controlled wealth and influence and the automatic deference that came with noble blood. Now he was just a man standing on a hill beside a woman he loved, looking at farmland that would belong to the people who worked it, believing that this small transformation mattered, even though he'd never see the world it might eventually create. His father had been wrong. The Blackthorne line hadn't ended. It had evolved into something the old lord couldn't have imagined. Someone willing to burn down an empire to plant something better in the ashes. Someone who measured strength not by what you could take, but by what you were willing to sacrifice for people you'd never meet. The light faded. Stars emerged. The ruins disappeared into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the future was being built by people who now owned their own land and carried the memory that change was possible because someone had been desperate or crazy or honest enough to choose destruction over complicity. It wasn't the ending Adrian had expected when he'd walked into that opera house months ago. Wasn't the ending anyone would write if they wanted audiences to cheer, but it was the ending that felt true. The one where victory looked like ruins and persistence and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd chosen right, even when right meant losing everything. Celeste squeezed his hand. Ready to go home? Home was a cottage on the edge of what had been Blackthorne lands. Small, simple, nothing like the manor, but theirs in ways the estate never had been. Earned through choice rather than inheritance, built on honesty rather than exploitation. Ready, Adrian said. They walked down the hill together as night settled over the countryside. Behind them, the ruins stood as monument to everything they'd destroyed. Ahead, lights from tenant farms marked spaces they were helping transform. And between them was only the present moment. Two people walking through darkness toward a home they'd built from the wreckage of an empire. It was enough. Not everything. Not victory, not redemption, but enough to keep walking. Enough to believe tomorrow might be different. Enough to sleep without dreams of fire and signatures and 83 documented atrocities that could never be undone but could at least stop being repeated. The Blackthorne Empire was ash. The dynasty was broken. The legacy was ruins. And from those ruins, something smaller but infinitely more honest was growing. A life built on truth instead of lies, on choice instead of inheritance, on love instead of power. That was the only empire Adrian wanted now, the only one worth building. The only one that mattered when everything else burned away and you were left standing in the light of your own choices, measuring the distance between who you were and who you'd become. He'd been a duke. Now he was something better, human, flawed, honest, free. And that freedom, purchased at the cost of everything he'd once valued, was worth more than all the estates and titles and noble certainty his ancestors had accumulated over 3 centuries of organized cruelty. The stars wheeled overhead. The earth continued its rotation. And 2 people walked home through darkness, carrying the memory of empire's fall and the hope of what might grow in its place.